The glass should never have moved. It was already halfway to his mouth when the waitress's hand slid in quiet, precise, almost gentle, and replaced it with another identical glass without a single word. No apology, no eye contact, just a shift so subtle that no one at the table noticed. No one except him. Robert Hale froze. Across from him, the man who had ordered the wine kept talking, his voice steady, confident, practiced. The kind of voice that filled boardrooms and silenced dissent. The kind that assumed control. The kind that never expected to be interrupted by a woman in a black uniform whose name he did not know. But Robert did not drink. He watched the waitress retreat 2 steps, her shoulders stiff, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on the floor as if gravity itself were pulling her down. He watched the faint tremor in her left hand as she reached the service station. He watched the way she did not look back, and in that moment something old and sharp stirred in him. Not fear, recognition, because people did not interfere with Robert Hale's glass. Not unless they had a reason strong enough to outweigh consequences. The dining room at Hawthorne House sat just outside Boston, tucked behind old trees and old money, a place where deals were whispered instead of signed. Soft amber light washed over polished wood and white linen. Crystal chimed faintly when someone shifted in their chair. Outside, rain tapped the windows with patient insistence. Mary Collins had been working this room for 11 years, long enough to know which men liked to dominate the silence and which men feared it. Long enough to know the difference between confidence and desperation. Long enough to know when something was wrong even before she could name it. She had not planned to touch his glass. At 41, Mary had learned the value of staying invisible. You brought the plates. You refilled the water. You listened without hearing. You survived. That rule had kept her fed, kept her daughter safe, kept her from losing yet another job in a life that had already taken more than its share. Her husband's photograph still sat in the hallway of their small apartment, the frame chipped the smile frozen from a time before hospital rooms and late-night phone calls and words like complication and irreversible. After he died, Mary learned to live carefully. She learned that trouble never announced itself loudly. It crept in, quiet, polite, wearing a suit. Tonight, trouble sat at table 7. Thomas Reed had arrived late, rain still clinging to his coat, his handshake too firm, his smile a fraction too slow. He had joked about traffic, about Boston drivers, about the old days. Everyone laughed. Mary noticed he did not touch his bread. She noticed the way his knee bounced under the table. She noticed the faint chemical edge in the air when he leaned forward, something sharp and unfamiliar beneath the wine. Robert Hale, meanwhile, said very little. He did not need to. At 68, he had already sold control of the company he built from nothing, already buried friends who thought power would protect them. He came to Hawthorne House to close doors, not open them. To end conversations, not start wars. He had chosen the private room because he wanted this finished cleanly. Mary circled the table, her tray balanced, her mind running ahead of her body the way it always did when she felt that tight pull behind her ribs. Thomas spoke too quickly now. He filled every pause. He reached for the wine bottle himself, his fingers lingering on the neck longer than necessary. When Mary stepped in to refresh glasses, he shifted his chair just enough to block her view. That was when she smelled it. Not the wine. Something else. Bitter. Medicinal. A memory rose unbidden, sharp as a needle. Her husband in the recliner pills laid out on a napkin. The warning from the cardiologist. Liquids act faster. Small doses can look like accidents. Mary's pulse hammered. She told herself she was imagining it, that years of grief had rewired her instincts, that she was tired, that she needed this job. Then Thomas leaned in his shoulder, brushing Robert's arm, his voice dropping as if sharing a confidence. Mary saw his hand tilt, saw the smallest flash of glass between his fingers, saw the way his eyes flicked, checking angles, checking witnesses. Her world narrowed. There was no time to call a manager, no time to accuse a man whose name hung on plaques across the city. No proof that would survive scrutiny. Only a choice between silence and action, and Mary had lived long enough to know that silence could kill. She did not spill the wine. That would have been obvious. That would have been a scene. She waited. Dessert plates arrived. Silverware clinked. Conversation loosened. Thomas laughed too loud at his own joke. Robert reached again for his glass. Mary stepped in. Her hand moved on instinct, smooth as muscle memory. She lifted one glass set down, another identical in weight and shape, the motion masked by the passing of a plate. Her sleeve brushed linen. Her breath caught. She said nothing. Robert's fingers closed around the new glass. The old one slid away unnoticed, except by him. Robert Hale had built highways and bridges, negotiated strikes, survived investigations. He had learned to read rooms the way sailors read weather. He saw Mary's jaw tighten. He saw the tension coiled in her spine. He saw fear, yes, but not panic. Calculation. Resolve. He set the glass down. Across the table, Thomas stiffened. His eyes darted. He watched Robert's hand. He smiled again, thinner this time. Mary retreated, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard it hurt. She felt the weight of what she had done pressed down on her shoulders. There would be consequences. There were always consequences. She wiped her hands on her apron even though they were dry. Robert did not drink. He watched Thomas instead. Watched the sweat gather at his temples. Watched his confidence fray at the edges. Watched the man realize something had gone wrong, though he could not yet say what. Outside, thunder rolled distant, but unmistakable. Mary moved through the rest of the room like a ghost, her ears ringing, her thoughts racing ahead to Emily, waiting at home with a neighbor, to the rent due next week, to the fragile peace she had just cracked open. She did not know who Robert Hale truly was. Not yet. She did not know the reach of his influence or the machinery that would begin to turn the moment he decided to pull on a thread. She only knew that for the first time in years, she had acted without permission. And across the room, Robert Hale sat very still, a man accustomed to power, suddenly aware that his life had just been diverted by someone the world had trained itself not to see. The glass sat untouched between them, a quiet line no one else in the room even realized had been crossed. Robert Hale did not touch the glass for the rest of the evening. He let it sit there between the bread plate and the folded napkin, a silent witness no one else acknowledged. Conversation resumed in fits and starts, voices rising, falling, filling space that suddenly felt thinner. Thomas Reed kept talking, but the rhythm was off now. He leaned back too far. He laughed a second too late. He drank water instead of wine and pretended not to notice the switch that had just rearranged the future. Mary moved like someone carrying a fragile thing she could not set down. Her steps were measured. Her eyes stayed lowered. Every sense stayed sharp. She felt the weight of Robert's attention without looking at him, felt it settle along her spine like a hand she could not shake. The room hummed with low voices and the soft scrape of silverware, but beneath it ran another sound, a tightness, the faint hiss of danger moving through air-conditioned calm. Robert watched without appearing to. He let Thomas talk himself into small corners. He asked questions that sounded casual and landed heavy. He noticed the way Thomas answered without meeting his eyes. He noticed the way Mary hovered just far enough away to be useful and just close enough to intervene again if she had to. That thought unsettled him more than the wine. At the end of the meal, checks arrived. Pens scratched. Chairs slid back. Coats were pulled on. Thomas clapped Robert on the shoulder with forced warmth and muttered something about old times. Robert nodded, polite, distant. The driver would be waiting. The night would close in around them. No scenes, no accusations. Not here. Mary cleared the table after they left her hands steady now, only because there was nothing left to decide. The glasses chimed softly as she stacked them. The switched glass went onto the tray with the others indistinguishable. She told herself to breathe. She told herself it was over. It was not over. Robert waited until the room was empty and the door stood ajar before he spoke. His voice was low, even a tone that expected to be heard without demanding it. Mary Collins. She stopped. No one at Hawthorne House used her full name unless they were reading it off a schedule or a time card. Hearing it spoken like that, precise and deliberate, sent a chill up her arms. She turned slowly, keeping her hands visible, her posture neutral. "Yes, sir." "You switched my glass," Robert said. The sentence landed without accusation, without heat. A statement of fact. Mary's mouth went dry. Denial rose on reflex, old and well-practiced, but she pushed it down. Lying would insult him. Lying would make this worse. She chose her words with care. "I handled the table the way I always do." Robert studied her face, the lines at the corners of her eyes, the restraint in her shoulders. He had interrogated men who folded faster than this woman standing in a server's apron. He saw resolve there and fear and something else. Responsibility. Why, he asked. Mary held his gaze for the first time. "Because I believed you were in danger." "Believed," he repeated softly. "I could be wrong," she said. "I often am not." Silence stretched. In it the rain intensified, tapping the windows harder, a steady percussion. Robert nodded once. He did not ask how she knew. He did not ask what she saw. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a card, plain white, no logo. A number, a name beneath it. "David Keller, my attorney," Robert said. "If anyone contacts you about tonight, you call him. If anyone asks you questions you do not understand, you call him. You do not answer anything on your own. Do you understand?" Mary felt the room tilt slightly. "I did not ask for this." "I know," Robert said. "Neither did I." He left without another word. Mary walked home in the rain because she needed the time. The bus felt too enclosed, too watched, water soaked through her coat. The city smelled like wet asphalt and old leaves. Each step echoed the question she had not asked. What have I done? Emily was asleep on the couch when Mary arrived. Her homework spread around her like fallen leaves, a pencil still clutched in her hand. Mary covered her with a blanket and stood there longer than necessary, listening to the steady, uncomplicated sound of breathing. The world had narrowed to this before. It could do so again. She would make it so if she had to. Her phone buzzed just after midnight. Unknown number. She stared at it until it stopped, then buzzed again. Her chest tightened. She answered on the third ring. "Hello?" "Mary Collins," a man said. His voice was smooth, practiced. "This is Peter Lawson with the Massachusetts Department of Consumer Safety. I have a few questions regarding your shift this evening." Her grip tightened. She thought of the card in her pocket, damp now from the rain. She thought of Robert's eyes, steady measuring. "I'm not available to speak right now." "This won't take long," the man said. "We have a report of an incident involving one of your guests." "I'm sure you do," Mary said. "Please contact my attorney." She hung up before he could respond. The phone rang again. She did not answer. It stopped. The silence afterward felt louder than the ring. Across the river in a quiet office lit by a single desk lamp, Robert Hale listened as David Keller spoke into a secure line. "Not law enforcement," David said. "The number traces to a burner, someone fishing." Robert's jaw tightened. "Keep her covered. Already done." Meanwhile, Thomas Reed sat alone in a hospital room, staring at the ceiling monitors, ticking softly at his side. His heart had done something strange, the doctor said. Probably stress. Probably nothing. Thomas knew better. He replayed the moment again and again, the way the glass had shifted, the way Robert had not drunk. He had underestimated a waitress. He had underestimated how many eyes were watching him now. By morning, the story had begun to move quiet as groundwater. Emails were sent, calendars cleared, questions were asked in rooms with no windows. Robert did not sleep. He did not need to. He watched the pieces align and waited for the shape to reveal itself. Mary went to work at the diner on Tremont Street because routine was armor. Coffee steamed, plates clattered. The regulars complained about the weather and politics and the price of eggs. She smiled and nodded and refilled cups. At 11, a woman in a gray coat sat at the counter and ordered tea she did not drink. She watched Mary over the rim of the cup and left without paying. Mary's phone buzzed again that afternoon. David Keller this time. "You did the right thing last night," he said. "That may not matter to the people asking questions. Keep your schedule. Do not change your route. If anything feels off, call me. Or him." Mary hung up and leaned against the wall behind the counter, breathing through the surge of fear. She thought of her husband's last night in the hospital, the way the nurse had told her quietly that sometimes doing nothing was not an option. She straightened. She poured another cup of coffee. By evening, the rain had stopped. The city dried itself off and pretended nothing had happened. Mary tucked Emily into bed and read 2 chapters instead of 1. Down the street, a car idled with its lights off and then moved on. Somewhere else, Robert Hale stood at a window and watched the harbor lights blink in steady sequence. He thought of a woman who had changed the trajectory of his life without asking for credit or permission. He thought of how many times he had walked past people like her without seeing them. The glass had moved. Nothing else would be the same. Mary learned quickly that fear does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it arrived as a change in routine, so small it could be dismissed if you wanted to keep breathing normally. The car that idled at the corner when she left the apartment Tuesday morning was gone by the time she reached the end of the block, but it had not been there the week before. The man on the green line who stood too close and got off at the same stop 2 days in a row never looked at her directly, yet she felt his attention like heat on skin. At the diner, the phone rang and went silent when she answered. No one spoke. No one apologized. Mary said nothing to Emily. At 13, Emily was observant in the way children of widows often are. She noticed the way her mother checked the locks twice, the way she paused before opening the door, the way she kept her phone face up on the table even during dinner. But Mary smiled, asked about school, listened to stories about a science project involving vinegar and baking soda. She laughed in the right places. She did not let her voice shake. At night, when the apartment settled into its familiar creaks and groans, Mary lay awake and replayed the sound of crystal sliding on linen. She wondered if she should have spoken. She wondered if silence had made things worse. The truth sat heavy in her chest. Once you saw certain things, you belonged to them. Wednesday afternoon, David Keller called again. He spoke in the careful, clipped cadence of a man who had learned to weigh every word. "We have confirmation the wine was altered," he said. "The substance was diluted. Non-lethal in isolation, but unpredictable. Combined with existing conditions, it could have triggered a cardiac event." Mary closed her eyes. So it was real. Yes. We also have reason to believe the person responsible did not act alone. Her stomach tightened. What does that mean? It means you were not a coincidence, David said. Someone noticed you noticed, which is why I need you to listen carefully. Do not discuss what you saw with anyone. Do not speculate. Do not confront anyone. Let us do the work. Mary thought of the woman in the gray coat of the unpaid tea. I didn't ask to be part of this. David was quiet for a moment. Then gently, neither did we. But you are now, and we intend to make sure you are protected. Protection arrived quietly. That evening, a man knocked on her door carrying a clipboard and wearing the expressionless calm of someone who did not expect to be invited in. "Ms. Collins," he said, showing identification she barely had time to read. "Building maintenance, routine safety check." Mary hesitated just long enough for him to notice. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. She stepped aside. He checked smoke detectors that worked perfectly fine, tested the window latches she had already tested twice that day, and replaced a hallway bulb that had not been burned out. When he left, he said nothing more than, "Have a good night." But when Mary looked through the peephole, she saw him pause at the bottom of the stairs and speak briefly into his sleeve. Across town, Robert Hale sat through a meeting he had scheduled months ago and said very little. Men argued about budgets and timelines. Numbers were thrown around with practiced indifference. Robert watched faces instead. He noticed which men avoided his gaze. He noticed who seemed relieved to see him still alive. He noticed who was too calm. When his phone vibrated with David's update, Robert excused himself without explanation. He stood alone in a quiet hallway and stared at the city through floor-to-ceiling glass. He had spent a lifetime believing that if you controlled enough variables, you could predict outcomes. Mary Collins had shattered that illusion with one silent decision. By Thursday, Thomas Reed had been discharged from the hospital. He gave an interview to a local paper, smiling wanly, attributing his scare to stress and exhaustion. The article framed him as a hard-working executive pushed too far. The comment section filled with sympathy. Mary read it on her break and felt something cold settle in her gut. That night, Emily asked, "Are we okay?" Mary froze mid-step. She turned slowly. "Why would you ask that?" Emily shrugged. "You just seem tight. Like when the car wouldn't start last winter and you pretended it wasn't a big deal." Mary knelt and took her daughter's hands, noticing how they were no longer small. "We're okay," she said truthfully. "We're just being careful for a little while." Emily nodded, accepting this the way children do when they sense the edges of truth. "Okay." The call came early Friday morning. This time the number was blocked. Mary answered because fear had already taken enough from her. "Hello." "You made a mistake," a man said. His voice was low, unhurried. "You should have minded your own business." Mary's breath caught. "I don't know what you're talking about." A pause, then a soft exhale, almost amused. "Of course you do. People like you always do. You think you're invisible. You're not." Her hand trembled. She forced her voice steady. "Don't call this number again." He laughed once. A short sound. "That depends on you." The line went dead. Mary stood in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly loud. She did not scream. She did not cry. She reached for her coat. David answered on the first ring. She did not embellish. She did not dramatize. She gave him the facts the way she once gave doctors symptoms they did not want to hear. When she finished, there was silence on the other end. "Where are you right now?" David asked. "At home." "Stay there. Lock the door. Someone will be with you shortly. I have a daughter." "I know." True to his word, help arrived within 20 minutes. A woman, this time older, calm, with eyes that missed nothing. She spoke to Mary in the measured tone of someone accustomed to fear. "We're not moving you tonight," she said. "That would cause more problems than it solves. But you won't be alone." The woman sat at the small kitchen table and drank coffee Mary did not remember making. She asked about Emily's schedule, about school pickup times, about neighbors who knew their routines. She did not promise safety. She promised attention. By midnight, the building was quiet. Outside, a figure lingered near the alley and then slipped away when a patrol car slowed. Somewhere a phone buzzed and was silenced. Robert Hale stood in his study jacket draped over a chair, sleeves rolled up. He listened as David outlined what they knew and what they suspected. "This isn't about the wine anymore," David said. "It's about leverage. Someone is testing how far they can go." Robert closed his eyes briefly. He saw Mary's face when he had spoken her name. He saw resolve there. He felt something unfamiliar press against his ribs. Responsibility, yes, but also respect. "Find out who called her," he said. "And David, make it clear to everyone involved. I am not negotiating through threats." When the call ended, Robert poured himself a drink and did not touch it. He set the glass down and left the room. Mary did not sleep that night. She sat on the edge of Emily's bed and watched her daughter breathe steady and unaware. The woman from security sat in the living room, silent, present. Outside, the city carried on oblivious. By morning, Mary understood something with painful clarity. She had not stepped into someone else's world. That world had reached out and wrapped itself around hers. There would be no pretending this had been a single moment. And somewhere beyond her view, forces far larger than a waitress and a glass of wine were beginning to shift, drawn inexorably toward the quiet woman who had refused to look away. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning, and Mary found out about it the same way she learned most things lately, not through reassurance, but through preparation. David Keller called just after dawn. His voice was clipped, careful. "There will be questions," he said. "Not about the wine, not directly. They will circle. They will test consistency. You answer only what you know, nothing more." Mary stood at the kitchen sink, staring at the thin line of light creeping over the rooftops. Emily was still asleep. The apartment smelled faintly of toast from the neighbor downstairs. "I didn't do anything wrong," Mary said. "No," David replied, "but that does not stop people from trying to make it look that way." By 8 in the morning, a black sedan waited at the curb. Not flashing lights, no uniforms. Just presence. The woman who had stayed overnight nodded once and opened the door. Mary kissed Emily's forehead and told her she would be back before dinner. Emily smiled, but her eyes followed the car as it pulled away, tracking it until it turned the corner. The building on Federal Street was old granite, darkened by decades of weather and caution. Inside, the air was cooler, heavier. Mary's shoes echoed on the floor as they walked past sealed doors and unreadable plaques. She kept her shoulders back, her hands loose at her sides. Fear tightened her chest, but she had learned how to carry it without showing the weight. They seated her in a narrow room with a long table and a pitcher of water she did not touch. The men across from her wore suits that fit too well to be comfortable. One woman sat slightly apart her pen, resting motionless on a legal pad. No one smiled. "Ms. Collins," one of the men began, his tone conversational. "You work at Hawthorne House." "Yes." "For how long?" 11 years. "And during that time you have served numerous high-profile guests. I serve whoever is seated at my tables." The man nodded as if this were an interesting philosophical point. "On the evening in question you interacted with Mr. Hale's party multiple times." "Yes." "Did you observe anything unusual?" Mary felt the moment stretch. She heard David's voice in her head. "Answer only what you know." "I observed that one of the guests appeared unwell later that night." "Unwell how?" "He left early. He seemed unsteady." "Did you see him tamper with any food or drink?" "No." The pen scratched once. Another man leaned forward. "Did you move any items on the table?" Mary's pulse quickened. "I cleared plates and glasses as part of my duties. Specifically, Ms. Collins." She met his gaze. "I handled service as trained." Silence followed. The woman with the pen finally spoke. "Thank you. That will be all for now." Mary stood on legs that felt strangely distant. She walked out without looking back. Outside, the light was harsher, the street louder. She inhaled deeply, filling her lungs as if she had been underwater too long. The woman from security opened the car door. "You did fine," she said. "That doesn't mean they're done. They never were." Across the city, Robert Hale sat in a different room with different men, the stakes spelled out more clearly. A screen glowed at the end of the table displaying timelines, call logs, transactions layered like sediment. David stood beside it, remote in hand. The call to Mary came from a prepaid device purchased through a shell company, David said. The shell traces back to a consulting firm that used to manage risk for Reed Industrial. Robert's jaw tightened. Used to. They were terminated last year, along with several others. Quietly. "So this is about legacy," Robert said. "Not money." David nodded. "Control. Fear. The belief that some people can still be managed through pressure instead of persuasion." Robert leaned back, steepling his fingers. He thought of Thomas Reed's interview, the practiced humility. He thought of Mary sitting alone in that narrow room, answering questions with nothing but the truth and her own spine. "They are escalating," he said. "Yes." "Then so are we," Robert said calmly. The next move came not as a threat, but as an offer. Mary received it by mail. No return address. Thick paper. Inside a single page printed in conservative font. An invitation to meet. No demands. No accusations, just a place and a time and the promise of clarity. She read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it on the table. The woman from security watched her without comment. "I'm not going," Mary said. "Understood," the woman replied. "That may not stop them from insisting." Mary closed her eyes. She thought of the sound of crystal sliding, of the moment she had chosen action over safety. "I won't be intimidated into a conversation I didn't ask for." The woman nodded. "Then we adjust." Adjustment meant movement. By Thursday, Mary and Emily were staying in a furnished apartment across town, neutral territory with unfamiliar noises and different light. Emily treated it like an adventure at first, marveling at the view, the elevator, the way voices echoed in the hall. Mary watched her carefully, noting when excitement gave way to questions. "Why are we here again?" Emily asked that night, sitting cross-legged on the couch. Mary chose her words slowly. "Sometimes grown-ups make other grown-ups angry for doing the right thing." Emily considered this. "Are you in trouble?" Mary smiled, a real one this time. "No, I'm just being careful." Emily nodded, satisfied. "Okay." That night, Mary dreamed of glass breaking. She woke with her heart racing and the certainty that something had shifted again. It had. Robert received confirmation just before dawn. The consulting firm had been retained by a subsidiary he had not reviewed in years. The connection was indirect but intentional. Someone wanted him to know they still had reach. He stood at the window, the city pale beneath early light. For the first time since this began, anger flared hot and unmistakable. Not for himself, for the presumption, for the decision to test boundaries by circling a woman who had done nothing but act with integrity. He picked up the phone. "David," he said. "Prepare the disclosures." David did not ask which ones. By afternoon, emails were sent to regulators, auditors, and board members. Documents moved from private servers into official channels. Names long shielded by obscurity surfaced in daylight. The machinery Robert had built decades ago began to turn against those who thought they understood how it worked. Mary felt the effects before she understood the cause. The phone stopped ringing. The car that had idled vanished. The woman in the gray coat did not return to the diner. The city exhaled slowly. David called that evening. "Things are changing," he said. "This doesn't mean you're free, but it does mean they're busy elsewhere." Mary sank onto the edge of the bed. Emily was brushing her teeth in the bathroom, humming off key. "What happens next?" "Now," David said, "we let the truth do what it does best. Take time. Take names. When the call ended, Mary sat in the quiet and let herself feel something she had not allowed in days. Relief, tentative, and fragile. Somewhere across town, Robert Hale poured a drink and finally took a sip. The glass was cool in his hand, solid, unremarkable. He set it down and watched the city darken. The storm had not passed, but it was no longer aimed at her alone. The first person to crack was not the one anyone expected. It was not Thomas Reed, who had learned early how to endure pressure by turning it outward, by letting others absorb the consequences. It was a mid-level executive whose name never appeared in headlines, a man who had signed forms without reading the margins and told himself that silence was the same as loyalty. He called a regulator late Sunday night and asked for immunity. By Monday morning, the story had shifted from rumor to record. Mary felt the change before anyone explained it to her. The air in the temporary apartment felt lighter. The woman from security arrived without the usual tightness in her posture. She drank coffee and stayed seated instead of standing near the window. When Emily left for school with a borrowed backpack, the hallway felt ordinary again, which frightened Mary more than the danger ever had. Ordinary could be taken away. David Keller called just after noon. "We have statements," he said. "Not enough to close everything, but enough to narrow the field. The pressure will increase." "On them?" Mary asked. "On everyone," David replied. "Including you. Expect another request to speak. This time it will be formal, documented. You'll have counsel present." Mary pressed her fingers into the edge of the table. "I didn't plan to become evidence. No one ever does." That afternoon, Robert Hale stood in a conference room with men who had once believed themselves untouchable. The mood had changed. There were fewer jokes, fewer side conversations. He spoke quietly and did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The documents on the screen did the work for him. Payment trails, contract amendments, the careful language of risk mitigation exposed for what it was, a system built to frighten, not to protect. When he finished, no one clapped, no one argued. One man cleared his throat and asked about next steps. Robert answered without hesitation. "Independent review, full cooperation, no exceptions." Afterward, he remained seated while the room emptied. David lingered. "You're making enemies," David said. Robert nodded. "I know." The call that Mary had been bracing for came that evening. A detective this time, credentials verified, tone respectful. "We'd like to ask you a few questions in the presence of your attorney." Mary agreed. The interview took place in a small office with a window that overlooked a brick wall. David sat beside her, silent unless needed. The detective asked about her routine, her observations, the sequence of service. Mary answered carefully, truthfully. She did not embellish. She did not guess. When she did not know something, she said so. At the end, the detective leaned back. "Ms. Collins," he said, "you understand that you did nothing wrong." Mary nodded. Understanding did not change how it felt. As they left, David touched her arm. "You held up." Mary exhaled. "I keep waiting for it to feel finished." David gave a small, humorless smile. "It never does, but it gets quieter." That night, Emily asked if they were going home soon. Mary told her yes, probably. Emily smiled and went back to her homework. The normality of the moment felt like a fragile gift. Across town, Thomas Reed sat in a different kind of quiet. The calls had stopped. The sympathetic articles had dried up. His phone buzzed with messages from people who wanted distance, not explanations. He watched the news without sound, his own name crawling across the bottom of the screen in a context he did not control. He poured himself a drink and did not taste it. He thought of the waitress, of how small she had seemed, of how wrong he had been. Mary returned to Hawthorne House the following week. The manager met her at the door, his expression unreadable. He cleared his throat. "We'll put you on lunches for a while," he said. Less attention. Mary nodded. Thank you. The dining room looked the same. The light, the linen, the quiet authority of money moving in soft shoes. But Mary felt different in it now. She moved with the same care, the same restraint, but something inside her had shifted. She had been seen. That could not be undone. At a corner table, a man lifted his glass and paused, watching her. Mary met his eyes briefly and looked away. The world did not end. Robert Hale did not return to Hawthorne House. He had no need to. His focus had narrowed, sharpened. The disclosures triggered audits, and the audits triggered resignations. Boards convened emergency sessions. Statements were issued. Apologies followed thin and late. One evening, Robert sat alone in his study and read the final summary David had prepared. It was thorough. It was damning. It was enough. He set it aside and thought of Mary Collins, who had never asked for any of this. He wondered what cost she would carry long after the headlines moved on. He picked up the phone and hesitated. He did not want to cross a line he had spent weeks defining. He wanted to offer something that did not bind, did not imply debt. He called David instead. There's a community fund on the North Shore, he said. Education support. Quiet, long-standing. Make a contribution, unrestricted. If anyone asks, it's in honor of someone who reminded me why oversight matters. David understood. Mary learned about the fund months later, not from Robert or David, but from a guidance counselor at Emily's school who spoke with careful excitement about opportunities. Mary listened stunned as options she had never allowed herself to consider took shape. She asked questions. She took notes. She did not ask why. That night she stood in the kitchen and watched Emily talk animatedly about classes she wanted to take, places she might go. Mary felt tears rise and let them fall. Not from fear this time, from relief. The city settled into winter. Snow softened edges. Time did its quiet work. The calls stopped entirely. The woman from security no longer appeared. Mary and Emily moved back home. The apartment felt smaller but safe. One afternoon, months later, Mary received a card in the mail. No return address. Inside, a simple note, in neat handwriting. Thank you for choosing integrity when it would have been easier to look away. No signature. Mary held the card for a long moment, then placed it in the drawer with other things she did not want to forget. Across town, Robert Hale watched a new generation take control of a system he had reshaped at considerable cost. He felt no regret, only a sober satisfaction. The glass had moved. The consequences had followed. Neither of them spoke of that night again. They did not need to. The silence had already said everything. Time did not close the door on what had happened. It changed the sound of it. By early spring, the city had learned a new rhythm. Construction crews returned to sidewalks. The river lost its gray edge. People stopped asking questions that had once filled entire news cycles. Mary Collins watched it all from the quiet edge of her routine, serving lunch, walking Emily to school, buying groceries on Thursdays, folding laundry on Sundays. The danger had receded, but the awareness remained like a scar that ached when the weather shifted. Emily noticed it first. Not fear exactly, something firmer. Her mother stood straighter now. She spoke less, but when she did, her words landed with certainty. At 13, Emily was old enough to sense when an adult had crossed a line and could not return unchanged. She did not ask questions. She simply adjusted the way children do when they trust that answers will come in time. Mary returned to Hawthorne House 3 days a week. Lunch service, quiet clientele, less spectacle. She preferred it that way. The evening crowd had always felt heavier, full of unfinished business and long memories. At lunch, people ate and left. Deals were discussed, but they did not linger. One afternoon, a man she did not recognize asked for a table near the window. He wore a windbreaker instead of a suit, his hair gray at the temples, his shoes scuffed. He ordered soup and tea and said thank you every time Mary refilled his cup. When she brought the check, he looked up at her and said, "You handled yourself well." Mary's breath caught. "Excuse me." The man smiled, not unkindly. "People like me notice things." He stood, left cash on the table, and walked out without another word. Mary watched him go, her heart racing. The encounter unsettled her more than any threat had. It reminded her that some doors never fully closed, that actions echoed in rooms she would never enter. That night she dreamed of the hearing room, the long table, the pitcher of water untouched. She woke before dawn and sat at the kitchen table until the sun rose, listening to the building come alive around her. Across the city, Robert Hale sat in his office and reviewed reports that no longer carried his name in bold. He had stepped back deliberately, handing authority to people who understood the weight of it. The company had stabilized. The investigations had narrowed. The worst of the damage had been exposed and addressed. It was not justice, not fully, but it was accountability. He accepted the difference. He thought of Mary often, though he did not say her name aloud. He had learned through her the cost of attention. He had also learned restraint. Power used carelessly left wreckage. Power held back could still shape outcomes. When David Keller suggested a private meeting, Robert declined. "Not yet," he said. "Let the quiet hold." David nodded. He had stopped trying to interpret Robert's silences. They had become deliberate. Mary's phone rang one Saturday afternoon while she and Emily were cleaning the apartment. The number was unfamiliar. Mary hesitated, then answered. "Hello." "Collins," a woman said. "This is Helen Prescott. I chair the Education Fund on the North Shore. Your name was recommended to us." Mary sat down slowly. "Recommended by whom?" Helen's voice softened. "Someone who asked to remain anonymous. We have an opening for a part-time position coordinating community outreach. Flexible hours. Benefits. I thought you might be interested." Mary closed her eyes. She thought of her years at Hawthorne House, of trays balanced on aching arms, of silence as survival. She thought of Emily doing homework at the kitchen table, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Yes," she said. "I'm interested." The interview was unremarkable. That was what made it extraordinary. No pressure, no hidden expectations, just questions about experience, reliability, judgment. Mary answered them honestly. When they offered her the position, she accepted with a nod that surprised even her. She gave notice at Hawthorne House the following week. The manager shook her hand a little awkwardly. "You were always solid," he said. "We'll miss you." Mary thanked him and meant it. On her last day, she walked through the dining room one final time, noting the familiar scuffs on the floor, the way the light hit the windows at noon. She felt no regret, only a sense of completion. Emily adjusted to the change with the grace of youth. She walked home from school now, instead of waiting. She spent afternoons at the library. She talked about college without lowering her voice. Mary listened and let herself imagine a future that did not require constant calculation. The letter arrived in late May. It was not addressed to Mary. It was addressed to Emily. Inside a single page explained an educational grant renewable annually, contingent only on effort and integrity. No conditions, no expectations of contact. At the bottom, a sentence in careful handwriting. This support exists because someone acted when it mattered. Mary watched Emily read it, her expression shifting from confusion to wonder. Why, Emily asked. Mary swallowed. Because sometimes people decide to help without needing credit. Emily nodded slowly. Like when you help Mrs. Alvarez with her groceries. Mary smiled. Like that. Across town, Robert Hale stood on a balcony overlooking the harbor and watched a ferry cut through the water. He had made the decision months earlier. The paperwork had been routed through layers of separation. No strings, no recognition. He had insisted on that. He thought of the waitress who had moved a glass without asking permission. He thought of how easily the world dismissed people like her until it needed them. He wondered how many lives depended on quiet courage that went unnoticed. In June, Mary and Emily walked along the river on a warm evening ice cream, melting too fast in their hands. Emily talked about a summer program she wanted to join. Mary listened, her mind unburdened for the first time in years. She felt the weight of survival lift, replaced by something steadier. Purpose. When they passed a man sitting alone on a bench, he looked up and nodded. Mary returned the gesture without fear. Later that night, after Emily fell asleep, Mary stood at the window and watched the city lights flicker on. She thought of the woman she had been before that night at Hawthorne House. Careful, small, unseen. She did not judge her. That woman had done what she needed to do to survive. But she was not that woman anymore. She had learned that silence could be chosen, not imposed. That restraint could coexist with action. That one moment did not define a life, but it could redirect it. Somewhere in the city, Robert Hale closed a file and turned off a light. He did not think of legacy the way he once had. He thought instead of moments. Of decisions made quietly without witnesses. Of the ripple that followed. The glass had moved. Everything else had learned to move with it. The letter arrived on a Thursday, slipped under the door, sometime between dawn and Mary's first cup of coffee. It was heavier than the others, thick paper, cream-colored, no logo, no return address. Mary noticed all of it before she noticed her own hands had stopped moving. She picked it up slowly, as if weight alone could tell her what it contained. Inside was a single page. Not a threat, not an offer, a notice. A regulatory review committee was reopening testimony related to the Hawthorne House incident. Certain omissions had surfaced. Supplemental statements were requested. Attendance was mandatory. Mary sat down. The kitchen was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a truck shifting gears outside. Emily was still asleep. Her bedroom door closed, her backpack already packed by the door, the way Mary liked it. For a long moment, Mary did nothing but breathe. She had known this was coming. David Keller called before she could reach for the phone. "I wanted you to hear it from me first," he said. "They found inconsistencies." "Not in your testimony." Mary closed her eyes. "Whose?" "People who thought time would bury things," David said. "It didn't. It rarely does." Mary pressed the letter flat against the table. "What does this mean for me?" "It means you tell the truth again. The same truth. With counsel present. No surprises." "But Mary?" His voice shifted just slightly. "This time there may be pushback. Not everyone is pleased with how much light has already come in." Mary let out a slow breath. "I'm not changing my story." "Good," David said. "Neither are we." At the Education Fund office, Mary tried to focus on her work. She reviewed schedules, answered emails, coordinated volunteers. Her colleagues moved around her, unaware of the tight coil forming in her chest. She smiled when spoken to. She nodded at the right moments. But beneath it all, she felt the familiar tension of being pulled back into something she had worked hard to step away from. At lunch, Helen Prescott noticed, "You're distracted today," she said gently. Mary considered lying, then decided she was tired of it. "There's a hearing next week." Helen's expression changed concern, sharpening into something steadier. "Do you need time off?" Mary shook her head. "No. I need things to stay normal." Helen nodded. "Then they will." That night, Mary told Emily the truth, or at least the shape of it. "There are some questions I have to answer," she said, as they washed dishes together. "It's about something that happened a while ago." Emily glanced up. "Are you in trouble?" "No," Mary said immediately. "I did the right thing. Sometimes the right thing just takes longer to finish." Emily dried a plate carefully. "Okay." The trust in that single word settled heavily on Mary's shoulders. Across the city, Robert Hale read the same notice in a different context. His copy came with attachments, timelines, and a request for clarification regarding certain decisions made during the initial investigation. He read it twice, then set it down and stared out the window. David stood nearby, waiting. "They're pushing back," Robert said. "Yes, because they think you'll retreat." Robert's mouth curved into something that was not a smile. "They've misunderstood me." The day of the hearing arrived gray and unseasonably cold. Mary wore a navy jacket she had bought for interviews. Her hair pulled back, her posture straight. David met her at the entrance and handed her a bottle of water she did not open. Inside the room was larger this time. More observers. More eyes. Mary recognized none of them, and that made it worse. Strangers carried expectations without context. They judged without history. The questions began politely. Then they sharpened. "Ms. Collins," one man said, leaning forward, "you stated previously that you did not directly observe any tampering." "Correct. Yet you intervened in service." "I adjusted service." "Why?" Mary met his gaze. "Because something felt wrong." The man frowned. "That is not evidence." "No," Mary said calmly. "It is judgment." A murmur rippled through the room. Another woman spoke. "Ms. Collins, are you trained in medicine?" "No." "Then on what basis did you determine risk?" Mary's voice did not waver. "On experience, on pattern, on knowing when someone is lying with their body even when their words are smooth." The woman scribbled something down. "Subjective." Mary nodded. "Yes." David shifted beside her, but did not interrupt. From the back of the room, a new voice entered the conversation. Calm, measured, carrying authority without volume. Subjective judgment is not the same as reckless interference. All heads turned. Robert Hale stood near the door hands at his sides, his presence altering the room's temperature. He had not been announced. He did not need to be. He continued. "Ms. Collins acted without benefit to herself. She took personal risk with no guarantee of protection. That is not manipulation. That is integrity." The chair of the committee cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale, this is a closed review." Robert nodded. "I am aware. I was invited." He took a seat, his eyes never leaving Mary. She did not look at him. She did not need to. His presence steadied the air. The questioning resumed, but its tone shifted. Less accusation, more caution. When it ended, Mary felt as though she had been holding her breath for hours. David squeezed her arm lightly. "You did well." Outside, the cold air hit her like a wave. She leaned against the stone wall and let herself breathe. Robert stood a few steps away, speaking quietly into his phone. When he finished, he turned to her. "Ms. Collins," he said. Mary met his eyes. "Mr. Hale." He hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you for telling the same truth twice. It's rarer than it should be." Mary considered him. "I didn't do it for you." "I know," Robert said. "That's why it mattered." They stood there, two people linked by a moment. Neither had sought bound now by something quieter than obligation. Respect. That evening, Mary and Emily ordered takeout and ate on the couch, shoes kicked off the television, murmuring in the background. Emily laughed at something on the screen, unburdened. Mary watched her and felt the tension drain away, leaving behind exhaustion and something like pride. Later, when Emily was asleep, Mary sat at the kitchen table and looked at her hands. They were steady. She thought of the letter under the door, of the room full of eyes, of Robert's voice cutting through the noise. She understood now that closure did not mean disappearance. It meant endurance. Across the city, Robert Hale poured a cup of coffee and sat alone in his study. He thought of the committee room of Mary's calm refusal to bend. He thought of how easily power could have crushed that if she had been alone. He made a note on a pad and slid it into a folder marked pending. Some things he knew now required patience. Others required standing where you were not expected. The city slept. And for the first time since the glass had moved, Mary Collins slept through the night, without waking, unaware that the final shape of the story was already forming, not in courtrooms or boardrooms, but in the quiet resolve of a woman who had learned that being seen was not the same as being owned. The call came 3 weeks later, quiet as everything else that mattered now. Mary was shelving folders at the education fund when Helen Prescott tapped the edge of her desk. "There's someone here to see you," she said. He didn't give a name. Mary felt the familiar tightening, then released it. "Send him in." The man who entered was not the one she expected. He was younger than Thomas Reed. Early 40s maybe, haircut too close posture, disciplined in a way that came from habit rather than pride. He wore a plain jacket, carried nothing, and stood as if he were waiting to be told where to sit. His eyes moved quickly, cataloging exits, windows, faces. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "Ms. Collins, my name is Mark Ellison. I represent a group of stakeholders who would like to resolve some lingering questions." Mary gestured to the chair across from her. "Stakeholders in what?" Ellison sat, folded his hands, unfolded them. In preventing unnecessary exposure, he said, "People are tired. They want closure." Mary studied him. She saw the tension he thought he hid, the faint sheen of sweat at his temples despite the cool room. Closure for whom? Ellison met her gaze. "For you." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were papers, neatly arranged, language precise, margins wide. A statement of clarification. An acknowledgement of misunderstanding. A proposal to settle any remaining ambiguity. No admission of wrongdoing. No mention of names. At the bottom, a space for a signature. Mary closed the folder without touching the papers. "You want me to say I was mistaken?" Ellison smiled thinly. "We want you to say the situation was ambiguous, that your actions were well-intentioned but based on incomplete information. People can accept that." Mary leaned back. "And what do I get in return?" Ellison did not hesitate. "Privacy. No further requests. No more hearings. No more letters under your door." He paused. "And a contribution to the education fund. Significant. Unrestricted." Mary felt something settle heavy and cold. She thought of Emily, of college brochures spread across the kitchen table, of the quiet pride in her daughter's eyes. She thought of the committee room, of Robert's voice, steady and unyielding. She thought of the word integrity, how easily it could be diluted if you let it. "I won't sign that," Mary said. Ellison's jaw tightened. "Ms. Collins, I don't think you understand the alternative." Mary met his gaze. "I understand it very well. You're offering me comfort in exchange for silence. I already chose silence once. It almost cost someone their life." Ellison stood abruptly. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Mary stood too slow or deliberate. "You're making it exactly what it is." He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "We'll be in touch." He left without another word. Mary sat down, her hands trembling now that the decision was made. Helen watched from the doorway. "Are you okay?" Mary nodded. "I will be." That evening, Mary told David everything. He listened without interrupting his silence, heavy with calculation. When she finished, he exhaled. "They're trying to cap the damage," he said. "That offer won't be the last. I won't take it, Mary said. "I know," David replied. "Then we prepare for escalation." Across town, Robert Hale received a summary of the meeting from a source who did not want credit. He read it twice, then once more slower. He closed the file and sat very still. "They've decided to pressure her," David said over the phone. Robert's voice was calm. "Then they've decided to test the wrong boundary." The next week unfolded like a tightening spiral. Anonymous tips surfaced online questioning Mary's judgment, her motives. A local blog ran a piece speculating about attention-seeking behavior in service staff. The comments grew sharp. People who had never met her felt entitled to opinions about her character. Mary did not read them. Emily did. Mom. Emily said one night, phone in hand, eyes bright with anger, "Why are they saying things about you?" Mary took the phone and turned it face down. "Because some people are afraid of the truth," she said, "and afraid people can be loud." Emily frowned. "That's stupid." Mary smiled. "Yes." At work, Helen called Mary into her office. "There's been some chatter," Helen said carefully. "I want you to know we're not questioning your role here." Mary felt a rush of gratitude. "Thank you." Helen folded her hands. "But I also want to be honest. If this escalates publicly, there may be pressure. Not from me. From donors. From boards. We'll stand by you as long as we can." Mary nodded. "I understand." That night, Robert Hale made a decision he had been postponing. He asked David to arrange a meeting not with Mary, but with the committee chair and 2 senior regulators. No intermediaries, no conditions. The meeting took place in a plain room with no windows and too much light. Robert did not threaten. He did not bargain. He laid out facts, timelines, patterns of intimidation. He named consulting firms and shell structures. He offered documentation and invited subpoenas. He spoke of public trust, of oversight, of the difference between accountability and theater. When he finished, the room was quiet. One of the regulators cleared his throat. "This will have consequences," he said. Robert nodded. "That's the point." The consequences arrived faster than anyone expected. A formal inquiry was announced. Names were withheld, but the scope was clear. The blog retracted its article. The anonymous tips dried up. Ellison stopped calling. Mary felt the shift again, subtle but unmistakable. The pressure eased. The noise receded. She exhaled, unaware she had been holding her breath for weeks. A letter arrived 2 days later addressed to her in careful handwriting. It contained no apology, no explanation. Just a single line. "The committee has concluded its review. No further action is required of you." Mary folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the card she had saved months earlier. She sat at the kitchen table and let the quiet settle. Robert Hale stood on the same balcony overlooking the harbor and watched the tide change. He felt no triumph, only a sober relief. He had not intervened to rescue Mary. He had intervened to remove an obstacle. She had done the rest herself. A week later, Mary and Emily attended a small ceremony at the Education Fund. Nothing grand. Coffee, folding chairs, a few speeches about community and persistence. When Mary's name was mentioned, applause filled the room, warm and unforced. She felt Emily's hand slip into hers. Later, as they walked home, Emily looked up. "You didn't back down," she said. Mary squeezed her hand. "No." Emily smiled. "Good." That night, Mary dreamed of the dining room again, but this time the glass did not move. It stayed where it was solid and unremarkable, and no one reached for it. She woke before dawn with a sense of completion she had not felt before. Across the city, Robert Hale closed a ledger and turned off a light. He thought of lines crossed and lines held. He thought of how power could be used to erase or to illuminate. The story had narrowed now not to scandal or spectacle, but to something quieter and harder to undo. A woman had refused to sign away the truth. A man had refused to let pressure decide the outcome. The city carried on unaware of how close it had come to a different ending. And Mary Collins, once invisible by design, moved forward with the steady knowledge that silence was no longer the only way to survive. The summer heat settled in slowly, the way truths often did, pressing down until pretending became impossible. Mary felt it on her walk to work, the sun already high, the sidewalks warm beneath her shoes. The city moved differently now. Not kinder, just quieter. The kind of quiet that came after something had been named and could no longer hide in corners. At the education fund, things returned to their steady rhythm. Meetings, budgets, conversations about students who needed more than grades could measure. Mary found herself speaking up more, offering opinions she once would have kept to herself. No one interrupted. No one questioned her right to be heard. That, more than anything, told her how much had changed. Emily grew taller that summer, her voice lowering just enough to surprise Mary when she spoke from another room. She filled notebooks with plans, circled dates on the calendar, talked about science programs and volunteer hours as if the future were something solid she could already touch. Mary listened, aware of the quiet miracle unfolding. Her daughter was not afraid of wanting things anymore. One evening, as they ate dinner with the windows open, Emily asked, "Are you still scared?" Mary considered the question carefully. She did not want to lie. "I'm more aware than I used to be," she said, "but I'm not scared the way I was." Emily nodded. "Like when you learn to ride a bike and you know you can fall, but you ride anyway." Mary smiled. Exactly like that. Across town, Robert Hale attended a board dinner he could not decline. The room was polished, the conversation polite. Men spoke of growth and recovery, of lessons learned. Robert listened and said little. He had stopped expecting understanding from people who had benefited from not looking too closely. When dessert arrived, a man at the table leaned in and said quietly, "You didn't have to go that far." Robert met his gaze. "Yes," he said, "I did." The man looked away. Later that night, Robert walked alone along the harbor, the water dark and restless beside him. He thought of the cost of what he had done. Not money, reputation, relationships, the quiet privileges that came from not rocking boats. He felt no regret, only a sober acceptance. Some things were worth losing comfort over. Mary did not hear from Robert during those months, and she did not expect to. Their connection had never been personal in the way people assumed such stories always were. It had been situational, ethical, brief. That was enough. Then one afternoon in August, a package arrived at the fund addressed simply to M. Collins. Inside was a book, old, hardbound, a history of civic oversight in Massachusetts. Inside the front cover, a note in careful handwriting. Accountability is not an event. It's a practice. No signature. Mary smiled and placed the book on her shelf. The final report was released in early September. It named patterns without naming every name. It acknowledged systemic failures and recommended reforms that would take years to fully implement. Commentators debated its significance. Some called it overdue. Others called it excessive. Mary read none of it. She did not need a report to tell her what she had lived. The calls stopped completely after that. No more unknown numbers, no more letters, no more men pretending to be helpful while asking for silence. The absence felt strange at first, like stepping off a moving train. Mary found herself bracing for impact that never came. One evening as she locked up the office, Helen joined her at the door. "You've changed," Helen said lightly. Mary laughed. "I hope so." Helen grew serious. "You should know there was pressure early on, to distance ourselves, to protect the institution. I didn't tell you then because it wouldn't have helped." Mary stopped walking. "And now?" Helen met her eyes. Now they use you as an example of how doing the right thing doesn't always destroy everything it touches. Mary felt a warmth spread through her chest. Thank you for staying. Helen shrugged. Someone stayed for me once. At home, Mary found Emily sprawled on the floor, surrounded by papers, acceptance letters, program brochures, a map with places circled. Mom, Emily said, grinning. Look. Mary sat down beside her heart, full to the point of ache. I'm looking. That night, long after Emily fell asleep, Mary stood at the window and watched the city lights. She thought of the woman she had been before Hawthorne House, measuring every move by risk. She thought of the choice she had made, not knowing where it would lead. She understood now that courage rarely announced itself. It arrived disguised as instinct, as discomfort as refusal. Across the city, Robert Hale sat in his study and read a letter from an old friend who no longer wished to speak to him. He folded it and placed it in a drawer without emotion. Loss. He had learned came in many forms. Some of it was necessary. His phone buzzed with a message from David. The committee has closed the file, publicly and privately. Robert exhaled. Good. There was a pause. Then another message. For what it's worth, you changed the standard. Robert stared at the screen, then set the phone aside. Standards were only as strong as the people willing to hold them. He had done his part. Others would have to decide what to do with it. Mary received one last call related to the incident weeks later from a journalism student writing a paper. She declined the interview politely. Some stories did not belong to the public. Some truths were better lived than retold. Fall arrived crisp and clear. Emily started her new program, nerves and excitement mingling in her voice. Mary walked her to the bus stop and watched her go backpack slung over one shoulder, chin lifted. When Mary turned back toward home, she felt something settle inside her. Not closure. Something sturdier. Continuity. She knew now that the world would not reward her for what she had done. Not consistently. Not fairly. But it had not punished her either. That mattered. The city moved on. People forgot details. New scandals took their place. Mary Collins returned to a life that looked ordinary from the outside. Work, home, quiet evenings, plans for the future. But underneath it all ran a current she could feel now whenever she chose. A knowledge earned and kept. That she was capable of acting when it mattered. That she did not disappear when tested. Somewhere, a glass sat untouched on a table, a symbol no one else would recognize. And that was enough. The first frost came earlier than expected, silvering the grass along the river and sharpening the air until every breath felt deliberate. Mary noticed it on her walk to work, the way sound carried farther, the way the city seemed to hold itself still for a beat before moving again. She liked mornings like this. They asked for attention. They rewarded presence. The Education Fund office was quiet when she arrived, the lights still warming the kettle humming softly. She set her bag down, rolled up her sleeves and began the day, the way she had learned to live it now with intention. Emily left for school with a scarf Mary had knitted herself, the yarn uneven, the stitches imperfect. Emily wore it anyway. She always did. They had learned together that perfection was not the point. Showing up was. In the weeks that followed, the story faded, the way most stories did not, with a final chord, but with a gradual lowering of volume. The reports stopped making headlines. The names that mattered receded into filings and footnotes. The city found something else to talk about. Mary did not miss the noise. She had learned how little it meant. At work, she helped families navigate forms and deadlines, translating systems that often felt designed to confuse. She watched students arrive with shoulders tight and leave with something like relief. She recognized the look. It was the same one she had worn when she learned the truth would not be taken from her if she held it steady. Robert Hale read the last internal memo in a quiet room and closed the file without ceremony. He had learned late in life that endings were rarely announced. They were confirmed by the absence of interference. The phone stopped ringing. The meetings grew shorter. People spoke plainly again. That was how he knew the work had held. He returned a book to a shelf he had not touched in years and paused with his hand resting on the spine. Accountability is not an event. It is a practice. He had written it once and meant it more now than when he first believed it. Mary did not see Robert again. They did not exchange messages or acknowledgments. There was no final conversation to seal meaning. That felt right. Their connection had never been about proximity. It had been about alignment, brief and exact like two lines crossing and then continuing on. Winter settled in fully. Snow softened the edges of the neighborhood. Emily came home flushed and laughing, boots damp stories spilling over one another. Mary listened and let the sound fill the apartment. She cooked dinners that warmed the hands as much as the body. She slept without listening for footsteps. On a Saturday afternoon, Mary found herself back at Hawthorne House for a fundraiser she had not planned to attend. The room looked the same, linen crisp, light warm, but she stood in it differently now. She spoke to people without lowering her voice. She moved without apology. A man reached for a glass near her and paused as if remembering something he could not name. Mary smiled and kept walking. That night, she took the long way home with Emily, past the river where the lights fractured on the water. Emily talked about a paper she was writing about ethics and responsibility, and how easy it was to think rules existed for other people. Mary listened and felt the quiet satisfaction of watching a lesson travel forward without being forced. Across the city, Robert Hale stood at a window and watched the same river carry reflections downstream. He felt older and steadier than he had in years. He had not been redeemed by the events that followed the night at Hawthorne House. He had been clarified. There was a difference, and he respected it. Spring returned tentative at first, then generous. The city loosened. Doors opened. People lingered again. Mary walked through parks with Emily and felt something like gratitude settle where vigilance had lived. She knew the world would test her again. It always did. But she also knew she would recognize the moment when it arrived. One afternoon, a volunteer asked Mary how she learned to stay calm when systems pushed back. Mary considered the question and answered simply, "I learned that calm is not the absence of fear. It is the decision not to let fear decide for you." The volunteer nodded and wrote it down. Mary went home that evening and found a small envelope waiting on the counter. No return address. Inside a single line in careful handwriting, "Thank you for holding the line." She folded it and placed it in the drawer with the others, a quiet archive of moments that did not ask for display. As the year turned, Emily stood on a stage and accepted recognition for her work. Mary clapped until her hands ached. She watched her daughter bow her head briefly, then lift it again, unafraid of attention. Mary felt a swell of pride that did not need witnesses. Later, as they walked out into the cold, Emily slipped her hand into Mary's. "You did that thing you always do?" Emily said. Mary smiled. "What thing?" "You chose the hard right instead of the easy quiet." Mary squeezed her hand. "Sometimes they are the same thing." They went home, the city closing around them, ordinary and vast, and full of small decisions waiting to be made. The glass had moved once in silence. It did not need to move again. The change it set in motion lived now in habits and posture, in the steady refusal to disappear when it mattered. If this story moved you, take a moment to like and subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments with 3 simple words: stand your ground.